Do you not think it's incredibly needed that international law and law of armed conflict particularly modernised to reflect this new world we're living in with the use of drones, autonomous vehicles, and so on?
I mean, international law is fine. I think the principles in the Geneva Conventions are perfectly good. You can't specify everything. You can bring them up to date.
How much of the treaties that the Russians and the Americans have been signing over, ICBMs and nuclear warheads, that seems to be drying up now. So where does this leave us?
Which is completely different to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Western values, rules, principles, or at least could take them or leave them, and they have power, they have influence.
This is The Global Gambit.
So, but just to be a little bit, again, devil's advocate here, because for me, I personally don't believe that NATO is some expansionist power. I mean, as I always argue, there is Article 13. You can leave at any time if you give a year's advance notice to the US and so on. But I also do empathise with how the Russians' perspectives feel, in that I think NATO tried. There was the Founding Act of 97, there was the NATO-Russia Council of 2002. These were interesting initiatives, but do you not think there could have been better ways that the alliance could have engaged the Kremlin on reassurance about some concerns that they had, or this was always going to happen regardless because the Russians, well, Putin specifically, I don't want to blanket all of the Russians, but Putin's vision of the world just increasingly changed over those 2000s. Like, what happened between the early 2000s when you've got Putin visiting George Bush in his NATO Texas ranch versus 2007 and the conference in Munich and his speech?
I mean, I think there are two areas, one of which I think it was difficult for NATO to have satisfied Putin. The second, which was a general problem of NATO policy or Western policy. So Putin came in during Kosovo. I think NATO did the right thing on Kosovo, but you could make a pretty strong argument that it wasn't the right thing, that it was interference in Yugoslav's or Serbia's internal affairs, and it created a tension with Moscow. And if you're saying that self-determination is important here, why isn't self-determination important in the Donbass and so on? That was, an argument that Putin used. So I think that created some problems. Secondly, you have Iraq 2003, which I spent good years of my life in an inquiry which was very critical of the British government's decision to go to war in 2003. I think it was the more I looked at it, the worse it looked. And I think that annoyed not only Putin, but annoyed other people as well. Though I think probably in his thinking, Kosovo was more important. Then you add in enlargement. But I still think the thing that worried him most was the Orange Revolution. I think that I don't think you can understate the importance of that, because that was the point at which people power on the streets of Kyiv and elsewhere shifted Ukrainian politics, and though the resulting government, obviously with the president poisoned, wasn't a great government and struggled itself. That then you follow it with what happened in 2014. I think that's the threat. It's a direct threat to what Putin would see as a much more civilized Russian way, which, when you look at what is said by the people around him, is pretty homophobic. It talks about gender issues and so on. I mean, some of it's quite weird.
Well, it's by Putin. I think that goes without saying, right?
Yes. It's very weird. But I don't think one should, because of that, it seems weird to us that one should underestimate it. So I put much more emphasis on the threat that Putin sees to Russia's internal sort of equilibrium and way of life and politics, than the sort of the geopolitical stuff. They could have lived with that. They lived with it before. And maybe, the West could have handled it better, could have been more sensitive on some issues, arms control issues, and so on. I wouldn't say that Western policy has been perfect. But once Putin sort of began this turn away from the West, it became almost impossible to find a way to establish a decent relationship.
Well, there's so much more to unpack there, but I'm going to shift to something that you alluded to, which is that, again, for many Russians, it's the hypocrisy, it's the double standards of the West to preach one thing but do another. The fact that a few treaties, like the ICJ and the ICC, I believe, they're both, Ukraine is a signatory to these courts, but it hasn't ratified them. So for a lot of people who are, shall we say, West skeptical or just, fed up with the US world-led order, et cetera, the hypocrisy is a sticking point. How do we address that? Is there a way we can improve on this, or are we too far in now that this sort of new Cold War or West versus East or whatever? Is there a way back from here or not really?
So first, it's clear that an important critique of the West, which we asked for by going on about liberal international orders and so on, which is relevant to economic policy, so it's never particularly relevant to security policy. It's an argument I've been in many times, and you can see it with the new government in the UK. We're talking about progressive realism and so on. Foreign policy is realist. It's bound to be. You're going to have to deal with countries whose values you don't share, whose practices you don't like, but are nonetheless important. You have to recognize power where it exists, which is one reason why you would expect in some shape or form to deal with Russia. So the more you sort of set yourself up as acting according to high principle and high values, you risk a fall, and accusations of hypocrisy becomes almost inevitable. At the same time, there are principles that are important, and the core principles of the UN Charter are not a bad place to start, certainly not invading countries to occupy them. You can invade them to rescue your nationals, or invade them because an atrocity is taking place and then withdraw. But actually to occupy them, to conquer, is going a lot further. So you've got to have some ideas of what's totally unacceptable. And then other issues, as with all law, become questions of fact. As we're seeing in the Middle East, you can have different views about what side of the law you're on, according to your judgments about who's responsible for what and what's taking place and what numbers you trust and so on. And these are the debates that go on in the ICC and the ICJ and so on. So in the end, I think Western policy, in the end, the problem that Western policy faced is in the 1990s, there was just this problem of primacy. It just the West had won the Cold War. Everybody else was far behind. The Russians were far behind. The Chinese were far behind. The Indians were far behind. And everything was going swimmingly for the West, and setting the standards about trade, about finance, about what democracy entailed, about what human rights entailed, and so on and so forth. And even then you could see the problems developing, because you might get cross with one country, but you then get cross in the same way with another one on the same issue, because they provided you with oil or something such. So I think it is a problem, and it would be foolish not to acknowledge it. In the end, you have to hope that first Western countries are a bit more careful now about what they get themselves into, perhaps more reflective and thoughtful, not quite so interventionist, although I think you can make a case for a number of the interventions that did take place, and you can note what happens when we don't intervene, but nonetheless, it just gets us into places where we're not welcome and get stuck. So there can be a more prudent policy from the West. But in the end, you have to deal a bit with your own way. It does affect your values, and it does affect the way you operate as a liberal democratic society. So there's tensions here. This is the whole point about international politics. in a lot of the previous discussion we've been having, a lot of it's about the interaction of domestic policy and international affairs. These days, that's much more pressing than I think it was in the 90s.
It's a good point. Something I think a lot about is transactionality in state politics. There's a lot more emphasis on just transactional methods, such as how the Indians manage their foreign policy, versus, say, the West, which is more values-based. But I did want to ask you quickly about international humanitarian law broadly, because for me, terms like ethnic cleansing have become widespread, but they're still not ingrained into international law. And generally, you mentioned Israel, so I want to bring in a slightly different theatre now as well, which is that the Israelis are, whether or not you agree with their conduct, but there's a lot of questions around the legality of some of their approaches. They, people put them at the forefront with the house knocking, using, to warn people that they're going to strike. Do you not think it's incredibly needed that international law and law around conflict particularly is modernized to reflect this new world we're living in, with the use of drones, autonomous vehicles, and so on?
I mean, international law is fine. I think the principles in the Geneva Conventions are perfectly good. You can't specify everything. You can bring them up to date in certain areas. The problem is enacting them. And you have the facts questions. People say this is a war crime. Well, it may depend. And you can see this on many of the debates surrounding Israel. Israel will always start from the position it's acting in self-defense. Self-defense isn't an excuse, as it happens, for breaking the Geneva Conventions. It's a reason to use armed force, but you've still got to be careful about how you do use that armed force. But not that many countries in practice are that careful. And even if they are careful, there'll still be horrible things happening. And what's the line between sort of malicious action and just carelessness? And this does make a lot of difference to those who get killed. So it's difficult. So I think the ethical principles behind the conventions, particularly how you deal with non-combatants, but also about how you deal with prisoners and so on, are very important. They should be ingrained into military practice, but a lot of the time they're not. And we've certainly got some pretty horrific examples from Ukraine of the treatment of Ukrainian prisoners, never mind the treatment of Ukrainian civilians. But nothing can be done about it because Russia is too powerful to be brought to account. Israel's a little easier to bring to account, although it's got its patrons too. So it's just difficult to do it on that basis. You can then look at it strategically and go back. What made a big difference to Ukraine's determination to resist? It was the revelations of what happened at Bucha, when you find that ordinary civilians were being murdered with their hands tied behind their backs, not that far away from Kyiv. And then the Russians start saying they're all crisis actors and so on. It's that hardened Ukrainian views. What's the point of letting Russia control anything if that's going to be the result? So, in the Middle East, years of behavior that on both sides hurts civilians, wrecks peace processes and so on, has a consequence. It leaves you in a position where you're sort of stuck with this as your only way of operating, because you've got no way of developing a political strategy that might find a different form of relationship with your enemies. So you've got to look at this sort of consequences, a consequential morality, as well as the morality of intentions. Both are important, but I tend to be more of a strategist, and it's bad strategy a lot of the time too.
I mean, yes, I'm inclined to agree with a fair amount of that. I mean, to quote good old Clausewitz, war is nothing but the continuation of policy through other means. But for me, what I worry about is that global or international policy, there seems to be a drying up almost of a willingness to converge on universal norms and principles. We seem to be more in an age of disruption where countries are acting very much based on self-interests. Yes, you can argue they always have done, but the willingness of them to deviate away from these treaties that have lasted for a long time. How much of the treaties that the Russians and the Americans have been signing over, ICBMs and nuclear warheads, that seems to be drying up now. So where does this leave us? I worry about the future of, you can argue about unipolarity and that it produces a more overall stability with the US as the global policeman, quote unquote. But if you've got more of these poles, more multipolarity, a United States that is internalized, I worry about this very much, if you understand my point.
Well, it's not to worry about, but I do think Russia has added enormously to the problems because it's utterly cynical. It doesn't say we're rewriting the old norms, we're looking at it in a different way. It says we're completely upholding international law and just point blank denies everything is it suggests it isn't, and it's gone rogue. I mean, in all sorts of ways. So it's become an utterly cynical actor in international affairs. And you can argue that all great powers are cynical in their way, and yes, they are. But there's but I think this just moved it to another level of cynicism, and that creates a problem. Secondly, you've got the China question coming in. I think China is a much more interesting power to deal with. It has much more of a stake in the international system, including the international trading system. Yet it has its own ideas about how the rules should be applied, especially to itself. So you have this problem of a lot of discussions going on in the language of norms and laws and rules and so on, but with a specific application. So, if you like, with Chinese characteristics. Now, I think you've always got a problem in dealing with an autocracy, which China is, especially one which has become more autocratic. It was much easier to deal with China when they had a genuinely rotating leadership, because there was a greater flexibility often in Chinese policy. But we are where we are. I think that how you develop a relationship with China is the big foreign policy challenge. And I don't think we've worked it out yet, because it tends to be, using a word used before, quite transactional. Some things we have to work with China on, some things we're aligned with China on, some things we're desperately opposed to China on, and so on. But you have to try and sort this out. I think Russia's just gone too far. I don't think it's important anymore, beyond the fact that it uses force to try to get its way, particularly in Ukraine, and you have to sort that out. If you sorted out Ukraine and Russia was sort of dealing then with the consequences, it's not clear the importance of Russia. Its role in the energy markets is far less than it was. Its relationship with China is a very odd relationship, which is quite unbalanced. So, I think the big challenge is China, but not just in the way that sort of, China hawks in the US talk about it as being about Taiwan and the next World War. That their issues, the security issues, are not trivial. But I think it's a much bigger issue of accepting that China is now the second biggest power, albeit one without the sort of a network of alliances that the US has. How do you work out the relationship between the two, between the West and China? And I don't, we're just not there yet. We haven't sorted it out, and you want it sorted out before we get into more trouble.
Well, that's easier said than done. I think, based in practice, a couple of points on that, because one of my biggest concerns about the CCP is the lack of crisis communications. When the air balloon happened, there's no direct link between the military commands of Beijing and DC, as far as
there's a bit more. You've got a basic problem in that power in China rests with the party. doesn't rest with the state. It doesn't rest with the military. The military, in fact, are servants of the party rather than servants of the state, and that's created difficulties. I think that there has been some improvement on that, and I think the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy that was very common a few years ago has been dampened down a bit. I think the Chinese saw that it just wasn't winning them friends or intimidating people in the way they wanted them intimidated. So there's been a slight move away from that, slightly improved communications. They, like everybody else, are watching to see what happens in the US elections. If Trump comes along, it'll be much more economically focused policy. It'll be about tariffs and currency rather than security, I think, although that's not how everybody views it. But I think if you look at what Trump says, it'll be about tariffs. So, it's tense with China, but, trade with China is so important, including to the United States, which is completely different to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that it just seems to me the incentives to try to find some modus vivendi are considerable. The risk you've got is, China has aspirations in the South China Seas. It challenges India's border, actually challenges Russia's border, and it challenges Taiwan. And so this is why all the scenarios are about China doing something to which we need to respond. I don't think there's much in particular that we would intend to do to China that would make it feel that it had to respond. It just gets cross. People have a civil conversation with the Taiwanese minister. They think that's, Chinese think that's a great insult. So we've got to work out how to handle that. But we've handled the Taiwan issue for a long time.
Well, yeah, we have, but that's changing. And the last question I have for you on this roller coaster of a conversation is a bit, I just want to hammer home this a bit more because, hopefully difficult roller coaster, but, the Chinese have largely had benevolent neutrality in their operations or their relationship to Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, to exactly your point, I think not enough people understood how significant the Russia strategical partnership with North Korea is, mainly from the Chinese perspective, because the CCP don't want that relationship. They don't want these two powers existing to destabilize their near abroad and therefore their economic trade and interests. So my question to you very simply is there an opportunity here for the West, or whoever it is, to leverage this, to either bring China more on side, or, as I asked John Mearsheimer a few years ago, to bring Russia on side against, whichever is the greater, destabilizer.
He'd go for Russia every time. I think what's going on at the moment is really interesting. A lot of Russians are very unhappy about how dependent they become on China because they've ruled out their European option. There's nowhere else really for them to go. You either go east or west, and they can't go west anymore. And with a country that's in a far, far stronger economic position. A few years ago, Putin talked about China was an economic superpower, but Russia was a nuclear superpower. Well, China's a nuclear superpower now as well. It's building up to the same numbers. The North Korea thing certainly irritated the Chinese because they see North Korea as a country that they desperately want to control, which is a hard thing to do anyway. And then, Putin went off to talk to the Vietnamese, who have their own confrontation with China, and to India, which, if you talk to Indians, are highly skeptical of Chinese intentions and have relied on Russia in the past as their balancer against China. Then you get the Chinese inviting the Ukrainian foreign minister over and talking about the principles of the United Nations. Now, none of this is to say that there's a break there in the Chinese-Russian relationship that's easy to exploit. But there's a tension there. And I think the Chinese are are not impressed by the way the Russians have behaved in Ukraine. They feel that they've been pulled along into something that they don't really like, that gets in the way of their relations with the West. They've prioritized economic relations with the West by and large. They've ignored sanctions, but other than that, where Chinese companies might be affected, Chinese companies have gone along with sanctions. So I think there is something that I don't think it's a natural alliance. You don't get the Chinese endorsing Russian war aims the way the North Koreans did, or the way even Belarus did. The Chinese have been much more cautious. And I think most people would assume if you do have any progress on negotiations, one way or the other, the Chinese are probably going to be in the mix somewhere, because they do have leverage over the Russians and nobody else does. So yeah, I think it's something that a new American administration should look at, but without understating the difficulties, because this is, everything goes through Z, and everything depends on how well it makes him look. And he has declared this to be a forever partnership and so on, that's not going to be easily broken. So you can look at what's going on and see possibilities, but still, it could be quite difficult to take advantage.
I'm going to be completely shameless and ask you one last final question, please.
One last question.
I hope I'm incentivizing you to return, but throughout this we've touched upon policy and war and the relationship, but we are in an age where the West is internalizing and traditional policy making is not that. We've got a potential Trump administration, and Trump wants to America first, which I understand. But if we're not able to ensure that the West retains any degree of unity, how can we exploit weaknesses in, say, the Russia-Chinese relationship, the Soviet Sino War over Manchuria in the 1960s, 70s, China's map from last year where they claim a whole load of countries' territories, melting ice caps, China's near Arctic power claims, that's all worries for Moscow. What are we going to do? And this isn't, I'm some advocate of fully of everything in the West is best, but how do we, or how does the US, whoever it is, how do we exploit this? How do we sort of ensure that we don't become so internalized we forget ourselves?
Yeah.
Sorry for that long-winded question, probably all over the place.
Well, I think the West has got to aware of its limitations as well as its strengths. It does have strengths, but it also has limitations. Don't try to do too much. Try to work out what is in your absolutely vital interests and what can pass. Have conversations. See what can be managed politically rather than by sort of sharp elbows muscling your way in. And you've got to be prepared to spend on it. I mean, you can't, the age of the peace dividend is probably gone, and it's not easy. All our countries are putting great demands on government budgets. And in Russia, you can ignore what civilians need, but you can't ignore what civilians need so easily in the West. So it's difficult. And, you need much more honesty in talk about trade-offs, what the issues are, in proper conversations internally about these things. And it's difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. Globalism and Western values, Western principles, Western rules could prevail. There's lots of countries with their own views which don't like Western values, rules, principles, or at least can take them or leave them, and they have power, they have influence, and to pretend that doesn't exist doesn't get you any further. It just means you'll keep on clashing up with others. To understand them, find ways of working around them, find ways of where interests can be aligned is a much more demanding politically, diplomatically, and so on. But I don't think it's impossible. It's just different from the time when we just assumed that the West was predominant and could lay down the law for everybody. We just can't.
Some very, I think, wise and humble words there. But Lawrence, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being very gracious with your time. Everybody, for watching, thank you very much. And as always, I wish you a peace of mind. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, Lauren.